They marched without weapons. Yet their voices shook the foundations of power. They were mocked, jailed, silenced, but they refused to surrender. And today, every ballot cast carries the echo of their defiance. This is not just history. This is the story of how courage rewrote democracy. The fight for women's suffrage in the United States was not a single protest. Not a moment, not even a generation. It was a 70-year war, a war fought without guns, but with words, marches, resistance, and relentless determination. It began in 1848, in a quiet town in New York. At an event now known as the Seneca Falls Convention, a small group of women and a few allies gathered to challenge a system that denied them the most basic rights. They could not vote. They had limited access to education. They had no control over property after marriage. Legally, socially, politically, they were invisible. But at Seneca Falls, they decided to change that. They drafted a document called the Declaration of Sentiments. It boldly stated that men and women were created equal. And then they made a demand that shocked the nation: the right to vote. At the time, even many women thought this idea was too extreme. But revolutions don't begin with comfort. They begin with courage. As the movement grew, so did its voices. One of the most powerful among them was Susan B. Anthony. She traveled across the country, speaking in halls, churches, and streets. She didn't just ask for equality, she demanded it. In 1872, she did something that changed history. She voted, at a time when it was illegal for women to cast a ballot. Susan B. Anthony walked into a polling station and voted anyway. Days later, she was arrested, put on trial, found guilty, but she refused to pay the fine. Because for her, this wasn't a crime. It was a statement. Her defiance exposed a simple truth. A democracy that excludes half its population is not a democracy at all. Standing beside her was Elizabeth Cady Stanton, a brilliant thinker and writer, who gave the movement its intellectual backbone. Her speeches and writings challenged centuries of tradition. Together, they transformed a quiet protest into a national movement. But this story is not complete without acknowledging a deeper truth, because the fight for women's rights was also shaped by race. One of the most unforgettable voices of this era was Sojourner Truth, a woman born into slavery, who rose to become one of the most powerful speakers of her time. In a historic speech, she asked a question that still echoes today. "Ain't I a woman?" With those words, she exposed the hypocrisy of a movement and a nation that spoke of equality, but failed to include all women. Later, another fearless voice emerged, Ida B. Wells, a journalist and an activist, and a woman who refused to stay silent. She fought not only for women's voting rights, but against the racism within the suffrage movement itself. She challenged leaders, organized protests, and demanded that Black women be included in the vision of democracy. Because equality that excludes is not equality at all. The resistance they faced was brutal. Newspapers mocked them, cartoons ridiculed them, crowds harassed them. They were called irrational, unfit, dangerous. But still, they marched, and when peaceful protest wasn't enough, they escalated their fight. Leaders like Alice Paul and Lucy Burns organized massive demonstrations in Washington, D.C. They picketed the White House. For the first time in American history, citizens stood outside the president's home, demanding their rights. And for that, They were arrested, thrown into prison. But even behind bars, they refused to be silenced. They went on hunger strikes, and in response, they were force-fed, a painful, violent process meant to break their will. But it didn't. Instead, it shocked the nation. People began to see the cost of denying women their rights. Then came World War I. As millions of men left for the battlefield, women stepped into roles they had never been allowed to hold before. They worked in factories. They ran offices. They served as nurses. They kept the country running. And suddenly, the argument against them began to collapse. How could a nation depend on women in war, but deny them a voice in peace? Even President Woodrow Wilson, who had once resisted the movement, began to change his stance. He realized that the world was watching and that democracy itself was at stake. Finally, after decades of struggle, the moment arrived. In 1920, the 19th Amendment to the United States Constitution was ratified. Women finally had the legal right to vote. It was a victory decades in the making, a victory built on sacrifice, pain, and unshakable determination. But the story didn't end there, because for many women, especially Black women in the South, the right to vote remained out of reach. Jim Crow laws, poll taxes, literacy tests, all designed to keep them silent. It would take decades more, and another movement, the civil rights movement, to push America closer to its promise of equality. So what does this story mean today? It means that every vote cast is not just a right. It is a legacy of women who refused to accept silence, who stood up when it was dangerous, who spoke out when it was forbidden, who fought not just for themselves, but for generations they would never meet. Today, when a woman walks into a polling station, she carries their story with her. Every ballot is a tribute. Every voice is a continuation, because democracy is not something that was given. It is something that was fought for and protected again and again and again. This is the story of women who changed America, not with violence, but with courage, not with power, but with persistence, and not just for their time, but for all time.